Okay, so we have been looking at the book of Esther, and last week we kind of took up the historical backdrop of the whole thing. We know that it was set in the Persian era when sometime just after the exile, because some of the Jewish people had returned to rebuild the temple, and then after that to rebuild the walls of the city. And so we took up the various verses in Ezra and the other supporting verses in Daniel and Nehemiah. And so we were able to glean a sort of a setting of the time and the culture around when this book was actually set up. We also looked at a little bit into the characters of Esther and of the king, and we know that he was actually Xerxes the First, and we looked at Haman. And I've been thinking about this earlier today about the history behind Haman, knowing that he was from the Amalekites, and we know that the King Agag was supposed to have been killed. It was an instruction that Saul was to kill all of the Amalekites, and he let the king live. So that would put Haman as royal stock as well of his time, which would also bring us back to the fact that Mordecai, being the Jew, and a part of, because obviously Samuel was the one who slaughtered into pieces, cut him into pieces really, the king at that time. So we get a picture of what went on, and that will have been a story that would have been told over the generations. And when we think of it, you sort of think, well, a long time had passed. The same thing here in this time. In fact, we have it all the way through, right up to Jesus' time. Jesus' biggest earthly enemy when he walked in his earthly ministry was the Pharisees.
Yeah.
The Sadducees. It was the religious people of the day who all had learned and were very knowledgeable, but they were definitely not godly. We know that because Jesus accused them himself of being that you are of your father the devil. So that was our sort of our look last week at what took place. The events, the victorious events that took place in the book of Esther are so historically profound. It's such a radical turnaround that to this day it's celebrated by the Feast of Purim, which we talked about last week as well. As we went on beyond the history aspect of it, we looked at how Vashti was dethroned, and how when Xerxes had returned from the battle, which was somewhere around 4 years after the event where he had called Vashti forward, some 4 years maybe passed, and his advisors thought to comfort him after his misery on the battlefield at this time, suggesting that he choose a new wife to replace Vashti. This meant that they went around and they gathered some 400 or so of the prettiest young maidens, and they brought them unto the king's courts. Have we even thought about what that must have been like? Can you imagine that the terror among the young women, because they were all aware that when they went to the palace, that if there was 400 of them, 399 of them were going to be unsuccessful. There was only going to be one winner. And they spent that year in preparation, but they still knew that there's only one person that's going to be called back to become the king's wife. And in essence, they were brought forward to create the king's harem, as it would have been known in those days, where they got to live in a section of the king's palace. When we were in China there, we went to one of the sites where at the Forbidden City, where the emperor there lives with 3,000 concubines, wasn't it? So you had the emperor's quarters and 3,000 concubines, and it was quite interesting that you got the story about what was taking place. These 3,000 concubines on the Queen's birthday had all to come and present their gifts to the Queen. We talk about low self-esteem in the world and in this country. How degrading is that? To be one of the 3,000 that every year you're so inconsequential that the emperor probably hasn't got round you, and at best, if he actually divides his time up evenly, he's only going to get round you once every 9 years or something. You know, not great odds, sure it's not. But when we look at, you know, this situation here, we know that the rest of these girls, their lives are over. They're looked after in the king's quarters, so their life's okay. They still belong to the king. And they won't get called. We read last week, I think we read it last week, that unless you're called by name. So some of them may never have been called again. What an existence. I mean, we sometimes pass over that because we're focusing on Esther. But the reality is that we have an awful lot of people that, I mean, we know the culture there as well, because when we seen Vashti, when she didn't cooperate and conform, they says, no, we can't be having this. There's no way that we can let all the women here even think that they've got that bit of control over their husband. We have got to put them back in their place, because there's going to be a complete rebellion here. And we look at our own lives and we think, you know, the things that you go through, but we have rights. Even in this country, with all the things that are going wrong, you still have rights. These women had no rights whatsoever, and they were looking about, and Esther was clearly favoured. I'm sure it didn't go unnoticed by the other women before she was called to the king, because she had caught the attention whenever she went in, and she was groomed, if you like, or prepared. Groomed is perhaps poor choice of words considering what grooming means today. But she was prepared to be pleasing for the king. She was advised, wear this, wear that, don't wear this, don't wear that, this is how you do your hair. We know that. It tells us that in Esther. And so she was led into the secrets of what was required to make the king happy. And she had a year to prepare herself.
She was only 14 or something when she married the king.
Really?
Was she only 14?
My goodness.
Seriously?
Where did you find that out?
She was a child.
That's great. What age Queen Esther was when she became queen?
Wow.
Well, find something on it for us, will you?
Leaders are all down to it.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't find that. I didn't find her age. So I didn't. I know that most of the women are probably in their 20s, but I'm not sure.
Oh my goodness.
There probably is an exact age, because it gives you it dates the event. We actually see a dating in the event, and we know that we can date the year that it is. So,
Child brides.
well, that's the norm. That's still the norm in those countries, you know, in the Far East. But when we see that, we start to see a picture of how downtrodden, and in those cultures the women are still downtrodden. You know, and I don't think we've any comprehension of what that must be like. We think about how we feel whenever we have been passed over, ignored, whatever. in our own situations and our own circumstances. It puts a bit of a different perspective on things. I just felt today, as I was just thinking about all those things, that the reality of what took place is immense. But the reality of God's favour on Esther is also immense.
This is 14.
14?
14.
So
Wow.
that means she was getting groomed when she was about 13 then.
Yeah.
My
She was
goodness.
14 when she married him. I know. That's right, it's incredible, isn't
What
it?
age he was?
70 or something.
He was 70.
Was he
The king was 70. Oh no.
It's the same one I
For
think
such a young person,
She was very wise and, you know, very mature.
Sister Mordecai.
Yeah, she was 14. She was born in 492 and she
Yeah.
married him in 478.
Yeah, it was 478, that's BC, wasn't it?
And she was born in 492, so she was 14 when she actually married him.
14
Right.
years old.
From the Jewish tribe, Judah and Benjamin, Mordecai and her.
Yes, which was obviously the descendancy of Saul, so it was the direct descendancy of Saul. That was what I was thinking about earlier. You know, Mordecai's roots and Haman's roots were, you know, the whole lineage was interfered with, brutally interfered with, and Haman wasn't going to be happy just with getting rid of Mordecai, wanted to get rid of the whole race. Because if you think about it, that's what the instruction had been to Saul,
Yeah.
was to rid the world of the Amalekites. It's actually very interesting, isn't it, whenever you start to look, because sometimes we read without
He
looking
was 40 when
into
he married her. Yeah.
40.
40. Oh, my goodness, that's big.
There, amongst the other women, it doesn't say,
Yeah.
but there may well have been other Jewish women amongst them, because a lot of the Jews had settled. Remember, there were very few of them had actually returned.
And Esther says that she was fasting with some of her maids.
So that would suggest that there
Yeah,
was some of the other ones were. They probably sought each other out,
Yeah.
and they would have been fasting together. And it's interesting, although there is no mention of God in the book of Esther, fasting alone is pointless. It's really just a diet. You know, it's just therefore the absence of the word God, or the absence of the reference to prayer in it, I think doesn't reflect that there wasn't any, because the Jews, they were following their culture, they were following their ordinances, and you know, even the statement from Mordecai, who knows that, you know, you're not here for such a time as this. And so there's an indication there that, you know, they are, it's just unsaid, it's accepted as this is how they live. They live as the Jewish people would have lived. We also know that one of the things at the time, that Esther was not called by the king for 30 days. Not overly surprising with all the concubines that he had. He didn't have to remain in the one place all of the time. But when we look, and knowing that Esther's just a young girl, I mean, how frightening must that have been? And then to be given that instruction from Mordecai,
Yeah.
you know, to stand and be accountable for the whole nation, like that takes a lot of courage
Yeah.
to stand up and be counted in that way at any age, but at 14.
Yeah. goodness.
You know, she must have had a very, very strong character. As you said, Nancy, the character had to have been. I mean, we know that she was orphaned, and so she'd already had a tragedy and trauma in her life, and then having to go to live with her uncle who was looking after her. Those events in her own life, she must have found a way of dealing with them. And I would suspect that, like David, she had some testimonies that gave her confidence, because David was only young when he faced Goliath. It tells you he was but a youth, so we know that he was young when he faced Goliath, and he had already faced the bear and the lion before that. And so the preparation of Esther may well have been things that we're not aware of, because you don't get strong like that if you're not prepared in some areas of your life. You know, a child who would be, well, they didn't really get spoiled and pandered to in those days the way they tend to today. They were brought up, and a male at 13 was deemed to be an adult and went through the bar mitzvah and things. And that is your sort of induction into adulthood and for the Jewish people. We don't see that today because we have the age of 18. And children are not made to be responsible when they're young anymore. There's very few of them. They're sheltered. Whereas in those days they were much more mature. And you know, although our children are more sheltered today, they have taken to finding their own maturity. When we look at the things that go on in schools now, and in the form of wanting to be more like their peers, and the drugs that go on, and underage sex and everything like that, whereas in this day they were put into their arranged marriage and, you know, looked at becoming the mother in the home, usually quite quickly. It's actually, the book is so rich and deep for study on how it affects us as women as well. One of the big things that we can actually glean from it is that it is an insight into how God does set us up in the midst of our circumstances to bring about a mighty victory. When the only way we can be delivered from it is by the hand of God, and He gets to show His power. And I thought we could have a look as well at what who else has been placed in situations in Scripture, as it says in Esther, for such a time as this.
Joseph.
That was one of the ones I first thought of. Yep. You know, he'd looked like every circumstance of his was quashed when, you know, he comes boldly and declares his dreams, and then he is sold into slavery. He's jailed for something he didn't do. There's none of those look like the outworking of God in his life. Really?
Far from it.
You know? But it's funny that the full circle of that comes back round to deciphering two dreams. Because that was the full circle whenever he deciphered the dream of the baker and the other one, baker and the wine taster. Wasn't it the wine taster, wasn't it? So we had he had deciphered that, and if you remember, he had said, "Remember me whenever you get restored," and he didn't. He promptly forgot all about him until it came that it was required for that other dream to be deciphered, and so we actually see the sequence of events that it came full circle all the way around. I just think it's interesting to see that God works in this way, that there isn't anything random in how he does things. We also see that Moses would be another one, and the plagues, and we know that his ministry was cut short. It seemed really harsh, you know. Moses was a faithful servant of God, and his ministry gets cut short because he loses his temper once. But the difficulty is that he has broken a type and shadow that God was intending for to reveal whenever he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And one of the interesting things whenever you look at the two witnesses in Revelation, it depends on exploring through the scriptures. It doesn't tell us definitively who it is, but Chuck Missler and such like would teach that Moses would be one of the people. His ministry was left unfinished, and the plagues, the gifts, if you like, that he was given, the powers that he was given, are the same powers that are going to be required in Revelation. So he may well be one of the two witnesses that we see. So it's interesting that the full circle of Moses' life will come back to the same powers. Joseph's was the dreams, and with Moses we will actually see the full circle of the powers of being able to do those plagues. One of the other ones, which was contemporary of the time, would have been Daniel. We know that he had obviously they all entered into this place where they were elevated to rule over vast geographical areas. You know, with Joseph being, you know, the major, you know, we know that he basically controlled the land because he was in control of the food source, and he was able to merchandise and bring about the best possible outcome, and everybody got fed. Not everybody remained rich, but everybody got fed and stayed alive. This control over the land, I just thought that we would read before we go back into Esther. Luke 19, and from verse 12, he said, therefore, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom, and to return, and he called his 10 servants, and delivered them £10, and said unto them, occupy till I come. But his citizens hated him, and sent a message after him, saying, we will not have this man to reign over us. And it came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Then came the first, saying, Lord, thy pound hath gained £10. And he said unto him, well, thou good and faithful servant, because thou hast been faithful in a very little, have thou authority over 10 cities. The second came, saying, Lord, thy pound has gained £5. And he said likewise to him, be thou also over 5 cities. And another came, saying, Lord, behold, here is thy pound, which I have kept laid up in a napkin, for I feared thee, because thou art an austere man. Thou takest up, and thou layest not down, and reapest what thou did not sow. And he said unto him, out of thine own mouth will I judge thee, thou wicked servant. Thou knewest that I was an austere man, taking up what I laid not down, and reaping what I did not sow. Wherefore then gavest thou my money into the bank, that at my coming I might have required mine own with usury? And he said unto him that stood by, take from him that pound, and give it to him that hath £10. But you notice that's equated with being a ruler over cities as well. The faithfulness of a servant brings us back to the rulership. last week we looked at what Esther meant. What did we see that it meant?
Hidden.
Yep, it's also star. I think that the root of it, the root of Esther comes from. I think that she was probably given the name Esther as a Babylonian name, which was part of the culture of the time in which she lived. That would have happened, and this custom to rename those according to what appears to be a theme running through it is according to one of their gods. And Esther was named after Ishtar, which meaning star, which is the goddess Ishtar. And this seems to have been her Babylonian name. They name other linguists who have looked into it and delved into it more deeply seem to have discovered, and they seem to be highly respected linguists, believe that it actually means something hidden. And so the overt meaning of it is the goddess, after the goddess Ishtar, and the underlying meaning seems to be something hidden, which I think is one of those double puns that the Holy Spirit has put in there to let us see that there's things on the surface and there's then things beneath the surface that you have to dig out.
Yes.
The treasure that you have to dig out. You know, it's our privilege to dig them out, tells us. I just thought, yep.
Do you believe in goddesses?
Do I believe in goddesses? In what respect?
Like, do you believe in them? Like, do you
Greece.
believe, like,
Greece.
they're real?
You mean like in Greece?
Yeah, but like in any form.
Like the under like Greek mythology, or is that what you mean?
No, I mean, like, do you just believe in them yourself? Like, or any?
Well, the source of any false gods is Satan, and so there will be powers behind these false gods that they have elevated, because the Bible tells us that there are other gods, because it says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That's one of the 10 Commandments. And so there are false gods, and they have made images. And we also know that these images are of the false gods, because it tells us, "Thou shalt not make any graven image of anything that is in the heavens above, the earth beneath, or the sea beneath the earth." And so if we look at those scriptures, we know that there are false gods, and we know that we are given the instruction that we are not to make any graven images, and then we are given the further instruction that thou shalt not bow down to these images. And so we have these direct instructions from God relating to these false gods. It's in Exodus 20 if you want to have a look where that is. So, very good question, Alicia. And yet in Athens you had the goddess Diana. Don't even ask about her. You don't want to know.
Aphrodite's and Michael.
The gods usually were from the astrologers. You listening, Alicia? The sun gods were from often the astrologers, because they determined that they would have been like the god of thunder, the sun gods, the moon gods, because they determined that the sequence of events that took place were according to the lunar calendar, and so they would have seen where the stars and things were in the sky at the time of the event, and that was one of the origins. So I know you like to gather little pieces of information. So anyway, I'll let you go and get your orders, yes. who else do we actually see in scripture that were reassigned Babylonian names?
Shadrach, Meshach, and
Abednego,
Abednego.
yes. To Abednego.
And Daniel, wasn't he Belshazzar or something?
Belteshazzar. That's right. So they were given the Chaldean names or the Babylonian names. We'll just have a wee look at that in Daniel 1. Again, the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he could bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. So here we know that we believe that Daniel was of the king's seed here. The children in whom was no blemish, but well favoured and skilful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of wine, which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It's strange, most people can't remember their original names, their Hebrew names. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Michael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the king of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. I think it's interesting though that all 4 of them were renamed, and yet Daniel is referred to as Daniel the whole way through it, because he purposed in his heart not to defile himself. He was not willing to take on the identity of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. He wasn't willing neither to take on the identity nor to look upon their culture and to receive. And this was a highly favoured position that he was given. He was nourished with the king's wine. The king, at the table that was set before them was well prepared and well furnished with good food. And we see that he had purposed in his heart from the very onset that he was not going to receive any of that identity. In our culture, really, we would call that compromise. And the easiest thing in the world to do is to compromise, because we are still in water. It makes for such an easier life to not stand up and be counted. It's interesting that when we look at that, God is my judge, he has made that declaration from the onset, and God did judge him in the lion's den. I mean, he validated Daniel and everything that he did and everything that he believed in. Hananiah means God is gracious. Mishael is who is like God, and Azariah is God helps. When it was changed to Belteshazzar, its meaning is Beltis protects the king, or when Bel was a Babylonian god. Now that's quite interesting, because Daniel never accepted any of the identities associated with his change and being brought into. It was like Moses, when he realised his origins, he forsook everything to pursue his identity, his own identity as a Hebrew. And here we see that Daniel has forsook everything to continue with his own identity of who he was, except on this one, the meaning of it is to protect the king. He did actually protect the king. He took that assignment upon himself that he would stand and actually be a friend of the king. And he did look after him, he did take care of him. Including the time that he was out in the field, by all accounts.
And another thing about the bell, what you started off with was Belfast. It's interesting, isn't
That
it?
is actually, that is,
There's
isn't
a
it?
bell there.
Mm. That is quite, I didn't even think about that. True.
There's a lot of that. Ballyhome,
Wow.
Bal.
Well, yeah. Mm. Hananiah, when it was changed to Shadrach, some transcripts have it Shadaku, which means command of Aku, which was a Babylonian god. And Mishael to Meshach, which derives from Meshaku, the Babylonian moon god Aku, meaning that draws with force. And Azariah to Abednego means servant of Nebo in Akkadian, Nebo being the Babylonian god of wisdom. I just thought that was a wee bit interesting. Just thought I'd have a wee look at that because they were, all of the names turned out to be after the Babylonian gods. So, yep. So we will go back now to Esther and we'll have our coffee first.